Hi everyone, welcome to our week 7 online lecture. Today we're going to be talking about reading as a form of learning, which I'm sure many of you have had experiences with in your college career or will have experiences with in your college career soon. There's no text in this class and we don't do a lot of reading in this class, but I want to prepare you for situations in which you will be required to independently learn through reading. So today's agenda, I'm going to give you a couple brief reminders. We'll talk about the knowledge construction process. We'll talk about reading as a means of learning, and we'll be done with this in about 15 to 20 minutes at the most. I do want to say that the next week we don't have a Monday class. It's Veterans Day. So on Monday the 11th, please don't go to Skagit Valley College. There will be no one here. And there will be an online discussion board for this week and for next week, and there will be an online lecture for next week. Next week's online lecture is very much related to this week's. It's just tips and tricks for improving your reading skills, which we won't talk about today. We're just talking about the theory of reading as a form of learning and why it's important for you to pay attention to when you're learning. Okay. And the next two discussion boards, this week's and next week's, you are required to prepare something, but you only have to turn in your discussion board. You do not have to turn in what you're preparing. Similar to the goals, I gave you those worksheets to fill out, and many people were wondering if you needed to turn in the worksheets. You do not. This week's discussion board is about creating a memory game, associated with the memory principles we talked about on Monday in class. Next week's discussion board is about finding a class where you have to do some reading. If you don't have that, then I gave you some other options as well. And using some of the techniques we're going to learn next week, try and learn through reading and then talk about your reflection. Okay, the knowledge construction process. So far in the class, we've talked a lot about how the brain works, right? It's really an important part of understanding what you go through biologically when you're coming in contact with new information and new ideas that you just don't necessarily grasp right away. There are a variety of reasons for that. We've talked about maybe the motivation of the instructor being a little bit different from your personal motivation or philosophy of learning. We've talked about your learning styles not necessarily fitting with the instructional methods and how you can adjust yourself, your own study habits to that. But most importantly, I think that we've talked about memorization and critical thinking, how those things relate to each other in the terms of critical thinking, relying on the memories that you have in order to form new opinions and new ideas. And memorization as a form of the earliest, most primitive form of thinking, which is essentially that learning can be defined largely as what you can remember, because everything else is based upon that. But what happens when you're asked to really know something? And by really know something, I mean really understand it and be able to give your own opinions and observations that are separate from bodies of knowledge. This happens a lot in higher education. We're expected to be content experts in your field if you're going to get a professional certification, or if you're going into a career that's in high demand of specialization. Then that specialization or certification that you're getting puts you into a category of knowledge that's expected for you are expected to be a contributor to that field, not someone who's regurgitating information, but rather someone who's adding to it. So we talk about data as this uninformed, very nebulous concept, and data is essentially just something that doesn't have meaning, but exists. So for me, the concept of space, it's just a lot of data. My mind can't wrap itself around the concept of space and how space and time work in tandem to create distances that are so large it takes millions of years for light to reach us, and when we're looking at stars, they're actually likely millions of years old at that moment at which we're seeing them. So to me, it's so difficult to grasp. It's just data. There's no meaning behind it. I'm not able to just go back and remember, oh yeah, this information about stars, because it's not information to me, it's just data. Okay, so data is everything in the world that you don't know. Then you go through a process when you come in contact with data and you're forced to understand it. And that is where you take the data and the contextual information along with it in order to create information. That did not come out the way it was supposed to. But it's supposed to say information, one word, not informatio. So when you come into contact with data that's very unfamiliar to you, and you have some context to it. So for me, if I were sitting in an astronomy class, for example, there would be context for me to identify why the data has meaning. Maybe not to me, but to the world or to someone. It's through that context that that data then becomes information. Memories that we create in our brains, those little wrinkles I was talking about in class in your brain, or the connections between synapses in your brain. That's information. That's something you can recall under the correct circumstances later on. But there's a deeper thought there, and this has to do with the critical thinking piece. And so when we think about something, again, this is supposed to say experience in one word, and we come into contact with information through context, and we experience that information and have first-hand experience or second-hand experience, primary research or secondary research, or we're learning in some way that's much more intensive than just watching or hearing, we are actually experiencing something, then that information becomes knowledge. Again, supposed to be one word. Knowledge being that piece of information that directly relates to you in some way. Okay? So I know about certain stars, primarily the sun, because when I was in an astrology class, I understood that through experience, what I'm seeing in the sun is actually the embodiment of our universe, or our galaxy, not our universe. And it's the center of our particular galaxy in a world of universes I couldn't possibly understand. So now I have a bit of knowledge relating to the sun, but certainly not relating to the universe as a whole. So if you think about this in a class context, if you go into a class, say a history class, that you've never taken before, and you have no background in this particular kind of history, that information that you're looking through or thumbing through in your textbook, if you're not reading it deeply, it's just data. In a context of a lecture or in a context of a specific chapter that you're reading, that you can understand, that becomes information, memorization. And in a situation where you're supposed to apply that information to something that relates to you, or something that's more interesting to you, or something that relates to something else, you're drawing a connection between different pieces of information through experience that creates knowledge. This is important when we're talking about reading, because I think it's good for you to know exactly why or how certain instructors believe that independent learning through reading is a valuable experience for you. So reading, let's talk a little bit about it. Some of you may shudder at the concept. Some of you may say, I can put down a book a day. So what is it about reading that is so divulgent for different people? Well, reading has a purpose, and that's primarily that it can reinforce existing data, information, or knowledge. So basically, if you're in that history class and you're confronted with reading a textbook of history you've never heard of before, it's either reinforcing or challenging existing data, information, or knowledge, depending on how deep in the subject you delve. So when I say reinforce, it means you're learning about something that reinforces either your belief in it, or your connection to it, or your understanding of it. When I'm saying challenging existing data information, it's creating a difference between what you know or what you think you know and what you're being told. So there's this gap of information now. So reading, just like a lecture, just like having a conversation with a friend, can create both of these situations depending on what you're reading and in what context. It can also create new information, data, and knowledge. So you could be reading a book that's so completely unfamiliar to you that it is creating new data or new information if you're reading it deeply, or by connecting to information you already know, create knowledge for you. So through a textbook, you could have the possibility of creating entirely new sets of knowledge. And that's a pretty powerful thing. This is a quote that I really like when we talk about reading, because I think it really reinforces its legitimacy as an instructional tool and also a legitimate way of communicating. And it says that language, especially written language, is human culture's best invention for enabling learners to accumulate substantial bodies of conceptual knowledge. It is one of the oldest forms, both of art and of communication, other than speaking. Writing down or drawing or visually representing some language or cultural icon is a way to transpose information from one generation to the next without losing meaning. So, in that sense, it creates a sustainable history of events. So long as the language of the word being used to write is consistent or understood throughout history, it will not unintentionally lack detail. Okay? Because it's coming from multiple sources. Writings are coming from multiple sources. They're coming from multiple points in time. We, as academic people, are able to go through and say, well, in the 1950s, they believed this about automobiles. In the 1970s, they believed this. 80s this, and now in the 2000s, they believe this. And this is how this has changed. And I know that because of what's written down. I wouldn't necessarily know that if someone who lived in one particular history just regurgitated what they heard from a previous generation. Reading also provides a baseline for consistent communication. So what that means is, as long as there's a shared language and a shared form of communicating across text or written words, people are able to consistently understand how to create knowledge for other people or how to communicate pieces of information. So that is why the English language is so complex. It's not just to be mean to us, it's to consistently communicate information so that we're not speaking so many different languages or writing so many different ways that we're not able to articulate information from one person to another. That may be useful in art, that sort of distortion of consistency, very useful in art, very useful in creativity, very useful in being an independent thinker. Not necessarily useful in terms of creating that environment in which one person's shared body of knowledge that's widely accepted can be communicated across large groups of people and across distances. So reading also helps you memorize data because it's something that's written down that you can look at either repeatedly. It might be in the context of something emotionally jarring, so it creates an impact on you or an imprint on you. Or it could be something that's reinforced easily because of the emotional response you get from reading it. It also helps you critically think about information because once you've memorized something, if you're able to compare different forms of text, compare different chapters, compare different authors, you're able to construct a more unified vision of what it is you're reading about. That's why I'm asking you to collect multiple different sources for your final paper. You could read one source, but that's just one person's opinion. And while it's certainly likely researched, well-researched information, I feel in order for you to fully gain the concept of knowledge, you have to have multiple sources to compare. So reading can be difficult for people, and it's not just about different abilities of reading, different experiences, and how you learned to read. It's really also about the context of how the readings are presented to you that can create difficulties for you when you have to memorize or critically think about different pieces of information. So the first piece I'm going to say here is when you don't understand what's on the page, when the words are too big or too long or in a different language that you just don't understand what it is, then your ability to interpret the context of what's being said becomes muddled, and learning through reading is no longer effective for you. We'll talk about ways to combat that. It makes it much more difficult and timely. But when you're reading a text that's above your reading level or above your reading level in a particular subject, using technical data or technical information or technical language that you don't know, it no longer adds value to you. It no longer adds meaning to you. It actually just creates another barrier to your ability to learn what's being taught. Reading can also be difficult when you want to have a conversation with the author of the text. So to be a truly critical thinker, someone who challenges the status quo, you should always be asking yourself, is this person right? Do I believe this person? Do I have experiences or opinions that negate what this person is saying in my own mind? You can certainly lend legitimacy to a person, maybe giving them props for the comprehensiveness of their study, but you can certainly identify shortcomings in their arguments when it's clearly biased or coming from a political or a certain kind of opinion that you may not agree with. Reading can also be very difficult when you take the information at face value. This is another thing that I just can't stand. And when a student is given a textbook by an author that they just trust and they just believe everything that's being written there. There are certain texts, certain novels, certain books out there that are really, really, really biased or really, really, really poorly informed or that are outdated. Never ever take information from a textbook from the 50s, 60s, 70s, whenever, and believe that it's still true. It might be, but it takes additional research to learn that. Even a textbook that was written a year ago could be outdated depending on the source. Okay? Your instructor's responsibility is to make sure that they're giving you the most accurate and well-researched information possible. But sometimes things change so frequently, what you learn in class one day could completely change the next. So ultimately, what you're learning is not universal truth necessarily, unless it's backed up by a lot of different sources. When a text is poorly written, meaning it's got poor grammar, it's got poor spelling, you don't understand what's being written, or you just don't like the phrasing that they're using, it dissuades you from being engaged in the concept of the text, and that often creates a situation where you will doze off or your mind will wander. Even textbooks that are technically well written can be incredibly boring, and when they're incredibly boring, I don't necessarily place them in the same category as a well-written book. There's so many well-written books that are engaging because they incite your curiosity. They make you question what is in each chapter and make you want to search for that knowledge. You will find those textbooks one day as you continue your education, believe it or not, even if you hate some of the textbooks you're working with now. All right, so we've talked about these challenges, right? There are ways to fight against them. And they are timely, and they are difficult, and they are absolutely necessary 9 out of 10 times. How many of you have sat down in front of a textbook and just thought, I've just read the same sentence 6 times and I have no idea what it said, and then you move on or you read it again? I have certain textbooks and subjects I didn't care about, or certain textbooks that I did not find engaging in topics I actually really did care about. I found myself skimming, and skimming can be effective, but not necessarily when you really want to grasp what the author is saying. So taking notes while reading is always helpful. I had a couple of you on that Cornell Notes discussion board say that your classes aren't always lecture-based, and so you had to take notes from a textbook. Totally valid. It's actually just another form of instructional tool that your instructor is providing to you. So certainly you'll want to use it by taking notes. If you don't take Cornell notes, and I get it, they're not for everyone, I don't want to hear you rise up against me with pitchforks and flames. It can be useful if you give it a chance. So I just suggest that for those of you who even found it mildly useful, consider using them again when you're doing your reading discussion board next week. Just throwing it out there will help you. But taking notes while you're reading is actually something that would keep you engaged, especially if you're a bodily kinesthetic learner or a linguistic learner. Writing down what you're reading may seem repetitive, but it is extremely useful. Look up words, phrases, ideas that you don't understand, and then reread the section so that you have the context of what it's saying. That takes a lot of time. So if there's one word that's clearly important in a paragraph, you just don't know what it means. You understand the context of the paragraph, you just don't know what it's saying. Look it up in Webster's dictionary, look it up in some trade journal, figure out what it means, and then go back and reread that section to make sure that what you're getting from that missing word actually adds value to that paragraph, and that you understand the context and that the context hasn't changed. That does take a lot of time, but again, if you're keeping up with your notes as you go, you'll be able to write in your cues column of your Cornell Notes section the words and phrases you don't understand so you can look them up later, along with the page number, so you don't have to go back and read the whole chapter. Have conversations with other people in your class about what you're reading after each assigned reading. That is difficult for people to schedule and find time to do. If you're an interpersonal learner, so many of you are such humongously interpersonal. It is amazing to me that more of you don't see each other after class and talk about what's going on. Not necessarily in this class, but maybe in others. Very, very, very valuable experience. Even if you're an intrapersonal learner, sometimes the ability to just sit there and listen to someone else's perspective on what you read or what they read will completely change the context and the understanding and the meaning for you. You can also put it in a different phrasing, which might help you a little bit. And always question what the authors write. If you're given a textbook in a class, you're given that textbook for a reason. Don't just go off saying this is not correct because Chad from CSS 100 said textbooks are bullcrap. No, not okay. What I'm saying is, every time you read an argument from a study, ask yourself, where was the study conducted? Who were the participants? How many people does the study apply to? Did they have outside sources? Did they do a literature review? You'll learn all these phrases in your English classes. And do I have experiences that are different from what this person is saying? You can still totally believe what they're saying and use it in your class because that's what you'll need to get an A in the class. But in terms of really understanding it, it's that independent thought process that's going to help you add value to the field, not just take common knowledge and accept it as universal truth. That's all I've got for you today. All right, we'll be continuing the discussion about our reading skills next week in our online lecture. Again, please do not show up to class on Monday. No one will be there. And if you have any questions about your paper, please send them to me in an email now rather than waiting until the last week or the last couple of weeks, because I have time now in my schedule to go through and read your drafts or consider your viewpoints about your topics. I gave you all feedback on your last discussion board about your topics, so go back and look at that. Hopefully I gave you some suggestions. So many of you are just so on track with your topic that you really don't need a lot of feedback, but I did give a little bit to everyone. If you did not turn in your last discussion topic and you still want that feedback and you still want credit, albeit partial credit, do send that to me in an email as soon as possible. I will see you all in a couple of weeks, not next week, but you will see my beautiful bouncing face in the online lecture next week. Have a great Veterans Day, everyone. And for those of you who are vets, thank you for serving our country. Have a great week, everybody. Bye.